Well, good morning. As Ron said, my name is Josh McKoon, and I've been in the state senate for the last 8 years. And it's true, Ron does have me on speed dial. I do remember one of the first times I met Ron, he was down at the Harris County Republican Party running for state party executive office, and just hearing him speak, I knew that's a guy who's going to move us in a positive direction. That's a guy who gets things done, and it's evident being here this morning. You know, he makes things happen. So thank you, Ron, for having me. Thank you to the party for giving me a few minutes to share with you. Before I get into my remarks, and I don't mean to start on a somber note, but I do think it's something we should all be mindful of this morning. I'm sure many of you saw the news about Chase Maddox, a Locust Grove police officer who was killed in the line of duty serving a warrant. He was 26 years old. He has one child with his wife. They've got another one on the way. If you go online, there's a GoFundMe set up for him, and I would just encourage you to do what you can to support their family and keep them in your prayers, along with Sheriff McBrayer in Henry County, because they're having to go through a real tough time right now. To get to the point of my remarks here, I am Josh McKoon. I'm a candidate for Secretary of State. What I'd like to do with the time I have with you today is talk a little bit about who I am and where I came from, a little bit about why I'm running and what I hope to accomplish in the office and why I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary. My family moved to Columbus, Georgia because my great-grandfather had a job opportunity. He came to Columbus to work at the Eagle and Phoenix Textile Mill, which is right on the Chattahoochee River in downtown Columbus. He worked in that mill for 50 years. My granddad dropped out of school in the 8th grade during the Depression to help take care of our family. He worked a lot of odd jobs until World War II broke out. He enlisted in the Army. He served in the Pacific Theater until the war ended. He moved back to Columbus. He married my grandmother, who worked at commercial printers at that time. He worked a lot of jobs when he got back. He was a railroad conductor. He was a milkman. Eventually, they saved up enough money to open a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. And that was the first of several small businesses they owned and operated. One of my first childhood memories is of refilling the Coca-Cola machine with Granddad at the laundromat, which was the last small business they owned and operated. My dad was the first member of our family that went to college. He went to Auburn University. He worked in that same Eagle and Phoenix mill in the summertime to earn tuition to go to school. He went on to law school and has practiced law the last 40 years, and I followed in his footsteps. I went to Furman University, so I was excited to hear Ron talk about going up to Greenville. I got some good memories up there for my undergrad. And you know, they tell you to get the bad news out of the way early in these kind of remarks. So I went to the University of Alabama for law school, so I want to just go ahead and get that out on the table with everybody right now. There is kind of a funny story about that. John Barrow, who is the likely Democratic nominee in this race, on the night of the national championship game, he called me out on Twitter and said, I hope all the candidates for Secretary of State are rooting for Georgia, even Josh McKoon that went to Alabama. And so I wrote him back and I said, and this is the truth, I've been cheering for Georgia my whole life, much to my dad's chagrin. And I said, you know, Congressman Barrow, I'm pulling for Georgia tonight, and I didn't even have to ask Nancy Pelosi permission. And I haven't heard from the congressman on Twitter since then. But I give you all that background just to tell you a little bit about who I am, where I come from, but also to say my family's really been able to live out our American dream. Each generation's been able to chart our own course, do a little bit better than the folks that came before. And one of the things that got me involved in Republican politics was a sense that it was getting harder for the average person to reach that first rung on the ladder to economic success, and that the primary barrier was a government that had gotten too big and gotten in their way. You know, we talk a lot about Georgia being the #1 state to do business, and that's a great thing. But what we're really talking about when we say that is that Atlanta is a #1 destination for Fortune 500 companies to put their corporate headquarters. And that's great. That generates economic activity. But for the entirety of the state, there was a study done recently by Georgia State University that over the last 15 years, our share of middle-income families has declined while our share of low-income families has increased. And what that tells me is that it is getting harder for the average person that's starting out to be successful. So what do we do about that? That gets me to why I'm running for Secretary of State. I'm running for Secretary of State to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. That's what it really boils down to. And what do I mean by that? When I talk about the fastest state in the nation to get a job, I'm talking primarily about the 41 licensed professions in this state, 41 licensing boards that issue over 100 licenses. You know, 40 years ago, fewer than 1 in 20 Americans had to get a permission slip from the government to go to work, because that's all a license really is. But today, more than 1 in 4 Americans has to have a license to go to work. And I just think the pendulum has swung too far in that direction. You know, there's reasons for the government to be involved in various professions, public health and public safety. But I think y'all would agree with me that if we stopped requiring that the state issue licenses to librarians, that there would not be a public health or public safety crisis tomorrow. So there's some things we need to do about deregulating, but then there are other professions where maybe we need to keep the license in place, but let's see how we can make it easier to get somebody to work. You know, a cosmetology license holder in this state, this is a license to cut and color hair and do nails. On average, that person spends 350 days in training before they get their license. Now, to give you a frame of comparison, an EMT license holder, this is somebody trained to give life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency, on average spends 31 days in training. Now, there is something wrong with the system that the license to cut and color hair and do nails is requiring 10 times the training as a license to render life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency. So there are two questions, as your Secretary of State, I'm going to ask with all 41 licensing boards. Is this something that the government should require permission slip for you to do as a vocation? And if it is, how do we roll back as much government to connect as many people as we can to the dignity of honest, hard work? That is job one for your Secretary of State. There's been a nationwide study performed that shows over 5 million jobs could be created nationwide with licensing reform. Now, you think about that in Georgia, 250,000 new jobs potentially created by licensing reform. That's 5 times the number of jobs that Amazon's promising if they locate in Georgia. And that doesn't require a tax giveaway. It doesn't require us to pass any special laws. All it requires us to do as conservatives is get the government out of people's way and allow them to go to work. So I'm very passionate about that issue, and I think it's something that needs to be a real focus for the next Secretary of State. Now let's talk for a moment about elections. I'm a lawyer. That's my professional background. I tell people I have 2 strikes against me. I'm an elected official and I'm a lawyer. But, you know, in my law practice, I have worked with businesses to form corporations and deal with the corporations division, but I've also done quite a bit of election law work, ballot access work, election contests. And, you know, Secretary of State's offices are getting sued more and more often all over the country. And why is that? Because the left in states like Georgia, they can't pass changes to the election law that make it easier to cheat. Because Representative Benton, other members of our Republican majority in the House and the Senate, frankly, aren't going to let them do that. So what have they done? They haven't given up and packed their things and gone home. They've said, instead, we're going to go to the courthouse instead of the State House and try to get our changes there. This past summer, some of you may be familiar that there was a congressional election. There was a runoff. There was a little money spent in that race, some television advertising. Karen Handel and John Ossoff. I don't know how many people are familiar with that race. But during that election, they sued and they said, you know, Georgia's 30-day blackout period for registration is wrong. You shouldn't be able to do that. And we went to federal court and a federal judge said, you know, I agree with you. And so he extended voter registration by 60 days. It was in the middle of the election, after the first round in April, but before the runoff in June. 10,000 new voters added to the rolls during that time. Now, why do we have a 30-day blackout period? So that we can figure out that someone is who they say they are and that they're eligible to vote. So that's incredibly important. And as your Secretary of State, if something like that happens, I'm going to take them to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals or to the U.S. Supreme Court if we have to defend the position of the General Assembly. We shouldn't just throw up our hands because a single unelected federal judge tells us we're going to change our election law. It's too important. We've got to protect it. But you've got to have a Secretary of State that understands the law and is not relying on a junior assistant attorney general who's probably in their first job out of law school to explain Georgia election law. You need somebody that can make that call who's in the office, and I can do that. What about the voting machines? A lot of people talk about the voting machines. You're all probably familiar with the touchscreen voting machines we've had for the last decade and a half. They're coming to the end of their usable life. I've spoken to the team that supports the existing machines. They say they can support it through the 2020 presidential election. But the next Secretary of State, working with the legislature and the governor, is going to have to implement a new solution. Now, I'm not here to tell you it's this machine or that machine. What I will tell you is this. We need an open and transparent process. This is millions of dollars of your money that's going to be spent. So we don't need to pick a vendor and then figure out a way to get to them. We need a truly open and competitive process when it comes to spending this money. And we need to make sure local boards of elections are involved because they are the ones that conduct the election. I will say one thing that I'm very supportive of is a paper element to our process that is verifiable. We are one of only 5 states in the nation that has purely electronic voting. That is going away. There was a mayor's race in Atlanta back in December. 100,000 people voted, roughly, 700 vote margin. One of the candidates wants a recount. You can't do a recount on electronic machines because you don't have physical ballots. So we have technology now that starts with a touchscreen machine. It prints out your ballot for you. You can confirm your choices and then turn that into a scanner that drops into a ballot box. So we have an electronic record of your vote, but we also have a physical backup. And I think something like that is very important because we need public confidence in our process. While I'm on that subject, absentee ballots, you have to show your ID when you vote on election day. You have to show your ID if you vote in person early. But there is no verification process for your identity in that 45-day window that absentee ballots are being issued. In Muskogee County, where I'm from, we had a situation a couple of years ago. A lady comes in the office. She's got 19 absentee ballots filled out in an envelope, about to turn them into the clerk. A friend of mine who's on our Board of Elections happens to come in, sees what's going on, and says, "Hey, wait a minute. How did you come across 19 absentee ballots?" She said, "Well, I work at this local nursing home. I'm just doing this as a service to the residents." Well, they separated out those ballots. They conducted an investigation. And what they found is that 15 of the 19 residents at that nursing home were not capable of signing their name or making their mark. But someone had applied for every one of those absentee ballots. Someone had voted every one of those absentee ballots. And here's a spoiler alert for you. They were not voting for Republicans, okay? So we've got to have a better process where we tighten that up. Now you may ask, well, did anybody get prosecuted? We're always hearing there's no voter fraud. Well, we've got 2 sworn law enforcement officers for the entire state to handle this, and there was no prosecution. Nobody went to jail. We did stop those people from voting, though. So that's something we got to work on. One other litigation issue, counties and cities around our state have been sued to force them to print ballots in languages other than English. Now, I just want you to think about that. To become a naturalized citizen, you've got to demonstrate proficiency in the English language. Yet we are allowing cities and counties to be sued, and frankly, they're giving in because it's cheaper to comply than to fight the litigation. The Secretary of State should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them. So let me close by telling you why I think I am your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary. As I mentioned earlier, John Barrow is the likely Democratic nominee. John Barrow is going to be a very formidable opponent. He was elected and reelected to Congress against very strong Republican opposition in districts designed to elect Republicans. So you need somebody who this isn't their first rodeo going out and communicating our issues and debating a very skilled opponent on the left. I would submit to you, I've been tested. I have that record. Whether it was our fight for ethics reform, whether it's been our fight for religious freedom, I've been able to take on controversial issues and win these debates. And I can do that with John Barrow. I can also prosecute the case against him and remind the public that he voted for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, that he voted with Barack Obama 85% of the time while he was in Congress, and remind people that this show he's trying to put on about being a conservative Democrat is exactly that, a show. I'm ready to do this job on day one. I've worked in the Regulated Industries Committee. I'm familiar with the licensing boards. I've worked in election law. I've worked in with the Corporations Division. Nobody's going to have to show me where the bathroom is when I walk into the job. I'm ready to do it on day one. The last thing I'll point to you is kind of where we are in this race. We just had the fundraising reports out this week. We are number one in terms of fundraising for the last period and the amount of money we have in the bank. That's not everything, but it indicates we have support, and we have support around the state. We're very well positioned to win the Republican primary and defeat John Barrow in November, but I cannot do it without your help. The election is on May 22nd. I need your vote. If you want to vote early voting starts on April the 30th. We'd love for you to sign one of the sign-up sheets that's on the tables here, and Rebecca Yardley will be happy to take those from you as you get ready to leave. But again, with your help, I can be your next Secretary of State so we can make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. Thank you for your time.